so that we could, here we go. Um, I asked to open up today's Lunch and Learn so that I could put into context a little bit the story you are about to hear. So I personally, I have been at Utah Clean Energy for 15 years now. That is 15 legislative sessions that I have worked with our team to advance smart policies around clean energy, energy efficiency, and electric vehicles. And I can say in my 15 years, I have never been through a session quite like this past one. As Josh is going to tell you, it was a doozy.
It was a session.
It was quite the session. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that what unfolded at the Utah legislative session was in response, albeit the wrong response, to what really has been incredible progress. With strong support from Utah Clean Energy, Rocky Mountain Power last year announced the largest addition of new renewable energy and storage in the company's history. It included plans for the timely closure of outdated coal resources and a smart transition to a modernized energy grid. And this came about through a highly complex utility proceeding called the Integrated Resource Plan, or the IRP, of which Utah Clean Energy's utility experts have intervened in for many, many years, and we strongly supported the results of the last IRP. Now, the response to that progress is what played out in the Utah legislative session. It was more or less a pendulum swing in the opposite direction. Now, we knew there were going to be going into the session, we knew there were going to be some headwinds following the announcement of the IRP and related consequences of wildfire lawsuits with PacifiCorp, federal involvement, and advancement of clean energy. But what the legislators ultimately passed was actually worse than anything we could have ever expected. But for us, always with an eye to the future, it really has underlined the need to educate our elected leaders even more about the benefits of a clean energy grid and the opportunities for Utah to responsibly make that transition. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Utah Clean Energy's Government Relations Director, Josh Kraft, to tell you the story of clean energy in the Utah legislative session. Thanks, Josh.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And thank you for joining. Just a quick check. Erica and Brandy, everyone can see my slides, right? And without being obscured by me. Okay, cool. So I want to thank everyone and thank Brandy for the generous introduction and a good overview of what happened in this session. Before I go into that story, I just wanted to remind everyone about our work in general. Utah Clean Energy, we are a nonprofit who works, we are ambitious, we're optimistic, and we work on the broad range of solutions in the climate and clean energy space, energy efficiency in buildings, decarbonizing our transportation sector, promoting renewable energy and zero emissions resources in our electricity supplies, and finally on leadership and on climate leadership. And that's where the work that we do and I do at the legislature is really a key component. We are work to build leadership there and across the state, and it's an important venue for us to advance our priorities. And we tried to do some of that in the session, but also to defend, play defense, and we saw a lot of that in this session as well. So I'll get into that in a minute. But okay, so I think everyone who was in this space knew that energy was going to be in focus this year in a way that it hadn't been in a lot of previous sessions. We actually worked on a quote before the session that Brandy helped write for me that talked about it being a jam-packed session, and it was a jam-packed session on the energy front. But it was also, I think, a tale of the way I'm thinking about it was a tale of two sessions with regard to energy and climate solutions. We are optimists and we seek to be opportunistic. And so we worked the 4 weeks of our 7-week legislative session were spent trying to advance some positive bills on clean energy, clean transportation, and energy efficiency. And I'm going to start by telling that story and our work there. The second half of the legislation, however, was fairly different, and in fact was pretty frustrating. It took a big turn around week 5, and we ended up playing a lot of defense, particularly in relation to bills about coal-fired power plants. So that was that's the second tale of this session. And I want to give a spoiler alert. We didn't get all of what we wanted, and I'm frankly a bit frustrated about where we ended up. We have some lasting bills that we're going to have to unpack and work together on to make sure we can continue to make progress. But Brandy's right. A lot of this, I just want us to keep in mind, was the fact that we have made significant progress and we're in a different environment, but we still have a lot of work to do. So that's sort of the high level view of the session. So let's start off with talking about where we began in the first few weeks and the work that we were putting into the bills that we prioritized as a team this session. So as we sat down in the fall thinking through, okay, how can we advance progress across the broad range of areas and work with the legislature to do so? The things that we identified were residential rooftop solar, zero emissions, medium and heavy duty vehicles, and incentives for energy efficiency in new residential buildings. And those are the 3 bills that you see here. I'll go into give a little bit on each of them, but mention that, so the first few weeks of the session, they're a sprint. People are getting their feet on the ground. We're talking with legislators. We're trying to get a sponsor. If you've ever tried to get a bill here, you're sort of biting your fingernails and biting my fingernails, waiting for the bills to come out. So that was sort of the first bit of this session, and negotiating with legislators in meetings and building coalitions to sort of make progress on these bills. And it'd be remiss if I didn't note to start off with that you all played an incredibly important role in this and the context that you made. I want to get into where they ended up, but I just have to note that we don't get anywhere without people, knowledgeable, kind, generous folks talking with their legislators about the importance of these bills and answering questions about them. Because they're not, as you'll hear in a minute, they're not simple. But we need legislators to understand and take the time to do so to make progress. So first bill, SB 189, net metering amendments by Senator Wayne Harper of Taylorsville, the Republican from Taylorsville, deals with rooftop solar. It's been a goal of ours to promote fair and stable credits for rooftop solar generation in the state. And we were pleased that Senator Harper, who's a Republican and the chair of the Senate Public Utilities, Transportation, and Energy Technology Committee, wanted to move ahead with the bill this year. And so we weren't sure this was, I'll be honest, we knew we were facing some headwinds on this bill moving into the session, but we saw an opportunity and thought, okay, we're going to work with Senator Harper, build a coalition, and see where we can head with rooftop solar, which we think is an important component of a resilient, clean energy mix here in the state. The substance of 189, SB 189, is that we were wanting the legislature to set a fixed level of credit for residential rooftop solar for customers served by Rocky Mountain Power. And you'll hear a lot about Rocky Mountain Power today. They're our largest monopoly utility, and the essence of the bill was to set that rate at about 84% of average customer costs, or about 9.2 cents a kilowatt hour. You don't need to know much more than that, other than that's between where our avoided cost for utility is and the whole residential retail rate. We're trying to find some path in the middle. And we had some really good discussions on SB 189, but we also ran into some opposition, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The second bill that we prioritized was SB 170, a Utah Clean Truck Incentive Program by Senator Don Ipsen. And part of this is that there's been an unprecedented amount of new federal funding available for a number of vehicles, but particularly medium and heavy duty vehicles. And so we saw an opportunity. Okay, how can we create a program that'll work for Utah that doesn't necessarily come at a cost to taxpayers? And the other portion of this is that even though medium and heavy duty trucks are not nearly as large in terms of number of vehicles as passenger vehicles, they're a big contributor to not only greenhouse gas emissions, but to air quality issues. And as we seek to expand, put in place perhaps new logistics hubs, new inland ports, this sector is going to be really important to air quality for the state of Utah. So the proposal was to create a tiered incentive program to help buy down those upfront costs for clean, medium to heavy duty trucks. I want to give a couple of shout outs here. My colleague Kelby Gopal has been doing some amazing work creating contacts with fleets, with folks who are going to purchase trucks, and some relationships with the Trucking Association, because we don't want just a lecture about this. We want people to actually use and adopt these vehicles. And I also have to give a shout out to some of my colleagues at Western Resource Advocates who really worked to find a conservative Republican sponsor for this bill. Senator Ipsen he's from St. George, but has been with the Trucking Association and is a trucker for a long time. So getting him as a sponsor was a really important win and part of that process. So that was bill number 2. And then finally, energy efficiency is such an important part of a clean energy mixture and an important part of how we deal with air quality in our state, make sure that we're keeping our energy bills down. We wanted to see if we could find some state funds for an existing energy efficiency program that was passed a couple of years ago for new residential buildings. There's a lot of tax credits and new grants that would support retrofits for existing buildings in the residential sector. That's so important. But we also wanted something that could help with new buildings, particularly given how much the legislature is prioritizing new home building and housing issues that we're having. So we wanted to see if we could find $2 million in new funds for this existing program. And we were able to secure a sponsor in Republican Representative Tom Peterson from Brigham City, who happens to be a building contractor, and my colleague Kevin Emerson has developed a relationship with. So here's we are. That's where we are at the beginning of the session, first 4 weeks, seeing where we can make headway on some really important bills to help reduce emissions and open up new markets for clean energy in these areas. But there was a lot of other things that were going on in the background. And I'm going to repeat some of the story that Brandy put out, but I think it's important to do a little bit of that. Most of you who work with us and at Utah Clean Energy know that we're seeing a sea change in our electricity sector. And that's because of the falling costs of renewable energy and the customer demand for new resources. So that means that utilities across the country are looking for opportunities to move away from more polluting resources, particularly coal-fired power plants, given its costs and risks. And for Utah, I think that this really began to hit home this year. And there's 2 factors that went into that. Brandy mentioned the first, which is that PacifiCorp Rocky Mountain Power had announced last year, and we think this is a good thing, an accelerated retirement for the coal-fired power plants it has in Utah, which happened to be in Emory County, Hunter and Huntington, as part of their integrated resource plan. It was not a fixed commitment. But it was a recognition of the fact that customers and other states are starting to look beyond coal, and that the economics of those facilities are starting to get tougher. The other piece of this was that the Intermountain Power Agency, which is a quasi-utility entity in Delta, Utah, that largely serves Los Angeles, has coal plants that it is large coal plants that do not have a purchaser after 2025, after LA moves out of those resources. And so those facilities have long been expected to come offline, and in fact are required to come offline sometime in 2025 or maybe 2026. But it's also been an area where the legislature has not been very happy about that and has long been uncomfortable. So there was a lot going on with this coal front. Throw in the fact that PacifiCorp, our largest utility, has been facing real challenges because of lawsuits and wildfires that happened in Oregon a few years ago. there's a lot going on. And the legislature has definitely been more and more vocally concerned that we're going to lose these coal plants and what that might mean, I think, culturally for our state, but also for the fact that, we're used to having these facilities selling power, and there's been a lot of concerns about reliability, what that might mean, what this transition might mean for our state. So that was part of this coming into the session that we knew was going to happen. So as we were working on our bills, there was a set of other bills related to coal-fired power plants that were starting to take shape. And I represented Mike Schultz, who's the new Speaker of the House, mentioned this early on. We knew that there had been some work, but we knew that there was going to be some focus on trying to keep these power plants running. And so as we were working on our own bills, some of these bills started to come out. And the one that we focused on the most is this first bill, HB 191 by Representative Colin Jack, Electrical Energy Amendments. I'm going to have to spend some time talking about the other coal bill that we're going to talk about, SB 224. So I'm going to spare you a very long explanation of this bill, but it is a sort of a bill that the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a sort of right-wing organization that promotes model legislation, had put out that passed in a different form in Kentucky that would have made it very hard to retire Rocky Mountain Power, which is our investor-owned utility, and the Public Service Commission, which regulates our utilities, to retire those facilities early. And that was clearly in response to what we saw in Rocky Mountain Power's integrated resource plan. We fought this bill. We made some arguments against it when it came in the House. And even though we didn't love it, there was clearly some negotiation and some changes happening, enough that I felt like, okay, this is a normal legislative year, one where we're kind of having a little bit of back and forth. We're not going to always agree, but we're going to have a discussion about it and a negotiation. There is also a bill, SB 161, Energy Security Amendments, that again is pretty complicated, but it was a big bill that sought to find a new buyer for the power plants at the Intermountain Power Project, the coal plants that are set to come offline. And again, it'd be challenging to unpack all this bill, but it's a big bill. And even though we also oppose this bill, I will say that there was a fair amount of inter-party discussion within the Republicans in the Utah Senate about how desirable this bill was, knowing that there are a number of air quality rules that those power plants need to come offline to comply with. There is also not a buyer for these very large coal plants. And so how do you keep the facility running without someone to purchase the energy? And so that sort of was the essence of where, so things were kind of starting to take shape on the coal front. And we were doing our work, monitoring these bills, making our arguments. But then things took a turn in week 5, and where we saw a different bill come out, and that has some sweeping implications for us and for our power sector that are going to be really important for Utah, and is going to cause us some real challenges. And so I want to take a few minutes to go through this bill, which you've probably seen a little bit about. It's never great, by the way, when it's week 4. Everybody who does work in the legislature is sort of starting to get tired and cranky by week 4. It's just past the midway point of the session. We've been there a lot. And then but if you're like me, part of my job is just to be on my phone, refreshing potential new bills that come out. And then I saw this on a Friday afternoon, whatever week 4 was, February 8th. And I thought, we're going to have some real issues for the rest of the session. Not that this was entirely unanticipated, but it's not great public policy, and it's frustrating when you have sweeping legislation come out halfway through. So with all that preface, what is SB 224, Energy Independence Amendments, do? There are basically 2 elements. And again, this relates to Rocky Mountain Power. Rocky Mountain Power is our largest utility in the state. It is overseen by the Public Service Commission, who regulates the rates it can pass on to customers. The This bill is an attempt to do two things. One, it's trying to keep the coal plants in Hunter and Huntington online for longer than 2032. Those are those coal plants that Rocky Mountain Power foresees. And the way that it seeks to do that is that it seeks to have Utah customers of Rocky Mountain Power pick up the costs for operating and maintaining those facilities particularly after 2030, when other states that are part of PacifiCorp, which is a 6-state utility, exit those costs later this decade. That is to say that Oregon in particular, who was our second largest PacifiCorp state, and Washington and California, who have smaller parts of Rocky Mountain Power, have said that they are not going to be paying. They're going to pay down the capital costs of those facilities and not be paying for those facilities after 2030. So the Utah legislature has said, we want Utahns to pick up the cost of those facilities to keep them operating and maintaining them after that time, and directs our Division of Public Utilities, which helps oversee them, to get into negotiation to purchase additional shares, those allocations in those facilities, as other states are doing them. And I'll note that these facilities are not new. They are coal is undoubtedly plays an important part of our electricity system, and we fully share the concern in the legislature about making sure we have an affordable and reliable power system. But there's a big risk in asking customers to take on the shares in these facilities that are aging. They're going to need upgrades. They will need coal to keep operating them, and so in our view, this is not only a risk from an emission standpoint, it's also a risk from a ratepayer and a customer standpoint. Importantly, and I think one thing that that was really critical not only to us, but our colleagues who are ratepayers, the Energy User Association, the folks, the director of the Office of Consumer Services, and a lot of large businesses, is that it really fundamentally changes the way that coal plants, what the legislation calls proven dispatchable energy resources, deals with coal-fired power plants. And that's that it basically would exempt those facilities from effective oversight before the commission. If usually a public investor in utility has to go and justify its cost as reasonable and prudent before a commission, and they get to weigh that decision, whether that's in the best interest of customers. In this case, this legislation flips that burden of proof and says, Utah customers, you, me, other legislators have to somehow show that these costs of operating, maintaining the coal plants are somehow not cost effective, for customers, which, given the level of information we have compared with Rocky Mountain Power and others have, is going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to prove. And I will say that it was not only we who shared those concerns with members of the legislature, but the former commissioner of the Public Service Commission, Thad LeVar, often was quite conservative. We did not always see eye to eye, was sharing that. So so we're starting to see that, hey, this is a big leadership bill, has a lot of problems. There is, and I should note that there is a component about helping to address some of the concerns about wildfire liability costs, but that PacifiCorp and utilities have been facing. That's a significant issue. I don't want to downplay that. At the same time, it was another cost that they're asking customers to bear, and to help pay for those costs. And there's a concern that fund isn't not maybe necessary, and also isn't necessarily as tightly drawn as it should be to make sure customers are protected when they're making those claims. So big bill, week 5. I want to, and one that we're starting to realize we need to do some real work on and build some coalitions around. I want to shift the story back to back to our bills, and to say, because I want to so we can wrap those up. Amidst all as we're starting to see, hey, we have a big bad bill we got to fight, we got to work on. We still want to help push our own bills and make sure our priorities get wrapped up. And so that was sort of week 6 of the session. I don't want to say where did we end up. And on our bills, on the pro clean energy legislation we worked on, it's a mixed bag. I will say that we had some SB 189, the rooftop solar legislation that we worked on. We made some really important progress, and I'm proud of our team. Proud of Sarah, our director. We had a great hearing in the Senate Public Utilities Committee. We got the bill out somewhat unexpectedly on a 4-2 vote. So we got the bill through committee. We got it to the Senate floor, but ultimately we couldn't get the support in the Senate floor to get it through over to the House. We faced some really strong opposition from Rocky Mountain Power, who did not want to raise the export credit rate, and found that we weren't going to be able to go where we wanted to go on rooftop solar this session. And we worked hard with the sponsor, Senator Harper, to see if we could find a compromise that might move forward, and there just weren't the votes this year. And I will say that we got further, I think, than most people expected this year on this bill. We knew it was going to be an uphill battle. So I am certainly disappointed, but it was in line with, I think, where we might have expected to get before the session. I think we built a coalition that will allow us to move forward on rooftop solar next year in the future session. So we're not getting up. We're not giving up. This is an important piece of our work. And I will say that there was another piece of legislation there were a lot of concerns with, related to consumer protection, called HB 215, which would have been very detrimental to the solar industry. And I want to take some credit for helping to kind of improve that bill, make it a lot better, and one that we're going to be able to it would have had some very detrimental impacts on the rooftop solar industry in the name of consumer protection. So I felt like the coalition we built had an impact that was very helpful. And we made some real progress here, but didn't get where we wanted to go ultimately. SB 170, the Clean Truck Incentive Program. That's our bright spot. And it's our bright spot even though we didn't pass a bill. In fact, SB 170 never even got a hearing. And however, the sponsor, Senator Ipsen, was great. And we had enough negotiating power that we are able to secure an agreement to start a program to help provide incentives for zero emissions medium and heavy duty vehicles using federal funds at the agency level between government agencies, and start that program without legislation. And I think that was a real win, one that will allow us to provide incentives and get that program going maybe even faster than we did with some legislation. So legislation, we care, we want to pass bills, but we also want to get good policy done. And this is an example of, I think we saw some advancement without legislation, but it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had a bill. So I want to say that this is promising. I want to we're going to have a little more announcement of that when some of the rules get finalized later this month. So I'm going to save a little of the good news for later, but that was good then. Finally, the Energy Efficiency Incentive Program. Honestly, this was a tight budget year this year, much tighter than we've seen in recent years. And unfortunately, there wasn't enough state funding to get the incentive program passed that we wanted to pass. I think a lot of legislative leadership called it a belt and suspenders year. So it was kind of that's kind of how it ended up. And so I think that it was good to have those conversations, but we recognized there wasn't the money this year from a state perspective, although again, there are a lot of new federal funds that I think can help this effort. So we're going to continue to look for opportunities there. And shout out to my colleague, Kevin Emerson, who helped to coordinate and get a sponsor for that bill. It was no small feat to get a Republican sponsor for that appropriation request this year.
Josh, do you mind if I project for just a second?
Yes.
So
I don't mind.
I just want to paint a picture, and I also want to acknowledge Josh and the group on this call, because at this stage of the session, what I hope people realize is Josh Kraft, who is my new hero after this session, he's sending texts and action alerts to our take action list. One day it's to call your legislator to support rooftop solar, and he's in good faith negotiations there. The next day we're seeing more action alerts, and he's juggling that to say, help us stop SB 224. This is going to hinder clean energy development. Like the ability, and for this group as well, so many people taking action right in the middle of the session. There was so much going on, stuff we're trying to advance and support, stuff we're trying to stop. All of you on this call, I know many of you took that minute and made the call and called your representative, which matters. Josh somehow kept his head on during all of this, but I just wanted to acknowledge the group and Josh at this point, because there was just such a mixed bag and so much going on at this stage of the session that it was bananas, but it was fun
Yeah.
bananas. There was a lot going on. And just a final note,
Yeah, it was mostly fun. I mean, it was
I
frustrating, but I mean, yeah, but no, it's good to, it was good to have some, thank you, Brandy. And I do want to say, like, whenever we talk to someone about the solar bill in particular in the Senate, they said, oh yeah, we've gotten a lot of messages about that. And that's what we want. We want them to know when we're starting to talk that people have weighed in and said that they think the bill's good. That's an important part of the process.
Yeah. And I forgot to mention this on the front end. Please keep posting your questions to the chat.
Yeah,
At the end of the
please.
presentation, we'll be circling back and have Josh and the team answer a bunch of questions. So with that, I'll mute myself back, Josh, to let you take over.
No, it's good. I will. So in the last week of the session, that's when we wrapped up the coal bills, and ultimately it was not the result that we wanted and we think is good for our state. Despite our best efforts, SB 224 energy independence amendments passed without the kind of changes that we pushed for. We really pushed to make some changes to improve oversight and ratepayer protections of the bill. Tried to make that case in both the House and the Senate. And I think the reality is that when a bill comes out in week 5, most legislators are not, particularly in the House, which is dealing with a lot of bills, didn't understand what the bill was, didn't understand what it did, but really we're looking to the fact that they got strong direction from leadership in both bodies that they wanted a bill to keep the coal plants running to get this wildfire insurance fund passed. And I do, before I mention that, I do want to again thank the Utah Association of Energy Users for their work, Western Resource Advocates for their work, the work that we did to try to get some amendments. We worked hard. We worked with the sponsor, with the sponsors in both bodies to kind of make some changes. It was to no avail. We didn't get the kind of changes that we needed, and it wasn't for lack of a really strong effort and I think some decent conversation. I do also, I don't know if Representative Briscoe is on today, who's a representative from Salt Lake City who paid attention to this. He offered a House floor amendment that would have improved some of the regulatory protections, offered some of that oversight ultimately. And there was a really good House floor debate. And thanks to him for helping to make that happen. That ultimately the House voted down his amendment, so it didn't get in. But I want to give him a shout out for having done that, for his work. Some of the debate wouldn't have happened without that amendment going forward. So that SB 224 passed last day of the legislature in the morning. And unfortunately, a similar version of one of the bills related to the Intermountain Power Plant, coal plants, SB 161, passed earlier that week as well. So it was a really strong coal push in the legislative session, which we think will have, frankly, a lot of unintended consequences. So because of that, we've asked the Governor Cox to veto SB 224. And are asking if you are willing to add your voice there as well. We sent out a take action this morning. Your voice here matters. And I don't think a lot of people understand the implications of this bill, understand what it does. And I think that, but I will say, whenever we talk to legislators, we had some good conversations, House members, this was on their radar screen. And it was on their radar screen because people like you weighed in. And that wouldn't have happened. I think we're not done with this story yet. Talk a little bit about that in a minute, but we're hoping to raise some important attention, even if the governor doesn't veto this bill. Calling for one and showing some opposition is going to make a difference in the aftermath of 224 to make sure that we can make the right decisions for our public utilities, in particular investor-owned utilities, and finding a path towards a more affordable clean energy future. We're going to have to live with this bill for a while, so it's important for us to try to get it right. Brandy, is there anything else I should add there?
No, that's good.
Okay, I'm going to put a pin on that one. We don't usually ask for vetoes, and I will say this is the first one in our time, but it shows the level of concern that this bill really is breaking with practice that we've had that's allowed us to have a diverse, affordable portfolio of energy resources, and allows us to bring online the resources of the future that we know that we need. So we want to make that case while we have a few minutes left. Oh, governor has until March 21st to decide on bills, so this is timely. He's signing bills now, so we want to make sure it gets heard. So before I do questions and open it up for questions, I know this is a lot. This is how I feel a little bit at the end of this session. And I fortunately still have a little more hair than Charlie Brown, which I'm happy about. Squiggly line. But I also just want to say, I do want to say, we know we're experiencing this together, and this just, I think, and so I feel fortunate to be in touch with everyone and our awesome team at Utah Clean Energy. This was a tough session in a lot of ways, and so we have some work to do. But it's good. It's just good to acknowledge that, and also know that there are brighter days ahead. And I want to say, so in terms of our next steps, and particularly in terms of some of the coal-related legislation, we're going to be working with our regulatory team before the Public Service Commission to see what strategies we have to move forward there, and to make sure we're not foreclosing opportunities to bring online cleaner resources in spite of some of the work here in the legislative session. We know that we have more education to do. There's a lot of fear, and I think it's genuine fear about the energy transition that we're making. But we also, I think, understand that we can be a leader in the clean energy space moving forward. There's a lot of positive development. And this session was a note that there's still a lot of confusion about what the costs and risks of delaying that transition are. And one that we need at Utah Clean Energy within our team to continue to talk to legislators and the public about the benefits, and some of the risks of delaying this transition moving forward, because I don't think those got full shrift. And then I want to say, I know this has been a theme, but just ask you to keep your voices heard, and keep your voices heard with elected leaders, with public officials. I don't think that what we saw in this session was necessarily a reflection of where the public is at, and where we can go. Even to some extent, I think our utility is wanting to lean more ahead of where the legislature was. And I think that having you in contact and us in contact with our officials will make such a larger difference. It's maybe a thin silver lining, but one important thing that I heard regularly from public officials this year was that they didn't want to block new clean energy efforts, and they didn't want to block new facilities from coming online. The clean resources, that's solar, wind, batteries, geothermal, clean hydrogen. I'm not sure that their actions are always consistent with that, but I think it's a shift to know that they think that there is benefit, and they know it's popular to help make this transition. And so your voice is really important. And we want to continue to find new and better ways to work with you, and with all our leaders to make that transition to a climate safe, cleaner, affordable, and more reliable energy future. And I'm going to close there, and with my remarks, and open it up to questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh. And
or comments.
We've got a few minutes for questions, and I've got a few in the chat here, and I would encourage anyone to pose any questions and or discussion. I'm going to start actually with a question about SB 161. Ron asked an interesting question. If IPA or DOE are considering litigation, or if we know anything on that level. And Ron, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to expand on that at all. Or Josh, do you have a response on any known litigation?
I don't. I would expect that, given the potential to disrupt some of the new projects that the Intermountain Power Agency has in process for a mixture of hydrogen, gas, and renewables that would help with the hydrogen electrolysis, that there may very well be a litigation on that front. And I think that, for either from IPA or the UAMPS communities, the municipal service providers who participate in that. The other piece of this, and I am not an air quality attorney and so but the retirement of that facility is an important part of a settlement related to coal ash there. It's also part of a regional haze state implementation plan, one of the existing rules there that the state is committed to. And so EPA is, my understanding is EPA is actively monitoring this. So I would be surprised if there isn't fallout if they find if there will be this alternative air quality permit that they're pursuing. So I think that will likely come. It's a messy path. It's a messy bill, particularly since SB 161 effectively calls on the state. My understanding is that the state has the right of first refusal. So potentially Utah taxpayers or someone are on the hook for paying to run that coal plant for this portion of the time.
Does that answer? Oh, you're muted, Ron. Sorry.
I was going to say, yeah, thanks for that color. It does seem so, I guess, Soviet-like for our state government to have a hostile takeover of a private enterprise that doesn't belong to them, and it's an interesting story.
It particularly for people, I mean, it gets complicated very quickly. And, I've done this for 8 years. The legislature and LADWP have created a very unique entity, and I think are trying as the state, as LA, but also frankly, utilities across the country moved away from coal. It's become a hot button issue and one that is not easily resolved in. Ron, I agree. I don't know. And the story about who could buy the coal plant or operate it has sort of remained fixed throughout the last couple of years. So and we need to be careful because we want to make sure that we're not, spending taxpayer dollars or litigation delaying a transition that we know will happen. So
I guess I would add one more thought as a question. Who's pushing these ideas that there's somehow out there a large buyer for a substantial amount of coal-generated electricity in the Western United States or anywhere in the United States where this IPP electricity could flow? That in itself is a very complicated situation if that were to happen. But where is that market? I don't see it anywhere. A market for coal burning electricity anymore.
We agree. And I think that there is a lot of, I mean, Ron, I'll just say that I think there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding about the concerns about reliability, and then also just how the markets work in the West. And I want to pin that for a minute and say that that's, I think, the conversation the legislature is having. And we share some of those goals, but the idea that we can somehow spend, I don't know, likely hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, finding a way to keep those coal plants running it's risky, and it's a problem, we're going to have to be unwinding.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Oh, Don, did you have a question?
I do. Following on from Ron Barnes' comments, don't you think it's kind of strange that the Republican Party, which is usually the advocate of market forces, had 3 bills this session, 191, 161, and 224, all of which say that, well, we're in favor of market forces only when they don't affect non-profitable coal-fired power plants. This is really a strange policy that they've got, and it's also kind of strange that they say that it was a belt and suspender session, but they managed to cut taxes as usual because because even though we don't have enough money, we can reduce our income. So, strange thinking.
Pre-existing beliefs always play an important part in bills that we focus on and pass, and there's some, and I'm going to leave some of that alone, but I will say that I think that we do know we have a complicated and important discussion about how to create a portfolio of energy resources that meet our climate needs, promote clean energy, provide the services that we, that we've been accustomed to. It's not an easy solution. It's not an easy conversation to have, and there isn't a true free market for power. That said, we do need to realize the risk that we are taking on by asking Utah customers in particular to kind of pick up the tab for operating facilities that may or may not be economic and may or not have a buyer. And I think that was underplayed in the discussion, and it's something, Don, I mean, that it's a tough debate we're going to have, and it's not only a debate that's happening in Utah. I think that there are some far right organizations that are pushing this, and I don't know how they're reconciling those two things. If I'm being honest, that is not going to be the cheapest path. We may need to operate some coal plants at some level longer than we would like, but doing so in the way that we're seeing in SB 224 is not the way to do that. That's punching a hole in our regulatory compact, and we're going to be left with some challenges moving forward there.
Hear it for market forces.
So on that note, there's an interesting question from Dave Fallon that if we could touch on, Josh. He was wondering who worked with Senator Sanderl to introduce SB 224, and or who were the key players, or do we even know, pushing it forward?
Dave, this is actually, I don't think we've heard the full story. I heard a lot of different stories during the session. We knew that this was, I will say that a version of this bill, because of this, it's called Energy Independence Amendments for a reason. The Utah legislative leadership was angry about some EPA rules that would have perhaps accelerated the retirement of those facilities. They are frustrated with West Coast states for pursuing a policy that they don't like, and think that we're going to have control and a lot of economic benefit from continuing to run those plants. And so I think, I would expect that I know that they were in negotiation with the Rocky Mountain Power and the utility to write the bill. I think their main priority was this wildfire fund, given that that's been such an important issue on their books. I don't know the full range of players. There was some both opposition and negotiation with a number of large energy users and their associations, the Utah Mining Association, the Utah Petroleum Association, the Utah Manufacturers Association. And some of those folks showed some concerns about this bill, given, again, some of the ratepayer issues. So I don't, and so I think that's a story that I want to learn a little more about, moving forward. My feeling was that it was the legislature and the utility that did the majority of work in negotiating with this bill, and it did not receive the type of input and stakeholder input from us, from regulators, from ratepayer advocates that I think needed to happen.
Thank you, Josh. The next question is from Abigail and Franz. It's kind of two similar questions or touching on the similar topic, which is, do you have any insights into Utah's energy sovereignty bill and the likelihood or not of it having an impact, and or, can it comply with keeping energy prices down? I'm not sure. I may not be explaining that as well as I could.
Franz, that's an interesting question. I don't know. There was a separate bill, SB 157, that was a pretty broad bill about state sovereignty and having the Utah legislature being able to basically ignore or flout federal regulations. That has all sorts of constitutional issues, and one that we're going to keep an eye on, particularly in combination with all these other bills. That bill passed very early. It was also by Senator Sanderl. And so the legislature is clearly prioritized sort of pushing back on what they saw as burdensome federal regulations. I think a lot of that in our space is a red herring. The markets, as Don was saying, and Dave were saying, are moving things in this direction in the electricity sector. We have to find a way to manage it. But I do think, Franz, I'll have to think about that question. It's an important one.
Good. And then Erica had a good question. Utah was recently in the media for being in the top 10 states for cheapest electricity. What do you think SB 22 is going to do to Utah's, or at least Rocky Mountain Power customers' rates?
So I think the likely result is that we're doing upward pressure on rates. We're going to see rate increases. At some point, we're taking on maintaining and using ratepayer dollars to maintain existing coal plants that are aging, as other states decide not to pay for those facilities. And we're moving away from a sort of technology agnostic, least cost, least risk portfolio resource planning in our electricity sector. And it's hard to imagine, some coal plants have run quite a long time. I've spent the last couple of weeks trying to look up what are the oldest coal plants in the United States. But those facilities, much as I respect, and we spent a lot of time in Carbon Emery County, the good people in those communities, they're not going to run forever. And the more we're spending our precious state ratepayer dollars for maintaining and upgrading those facilities, the fewer resources we're going to have to invest in new resources that can provide similar services. So I can't. Utah has had very cheap, particularly residential electricity prices, and this is going to potentially change that. And I'm not the only one. We're not the only ones to share that opinion, but we'll just have to see. Rate cases are coming here and in the next couple of months, and we'll be able to see in real time some of those changes.
Yeah, I think you have time for one more question. Tom Mills, I see here you have a question. Do you want to unmute yourself or pose it in the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Brandy. Yeah, Josh. Your last response was very similar to the question I had. As far as the rate increases go, do you foresee that being in the kilowatt hour form? Do you foresee that being in the monthly connection fee? And because of this bill, does that exempt these increases from going in front of the Public Service Commission?
They're still going to have to include them in proceedings that are before the commission, but they're likely, and I don't know if any of the other team can provide a little bit of perspective there. I don't know yet. There's not a separate surcharge that this will show up on. It's likely to kind of go into the fuel cost that the company passes on to customers. It's unlikely to be a fixed charge or a separate surcharge. To provide a sort of simple answer to your question, Tom, we'll be able to piece it out, but it's not necessarily like a separate line item that we're going to be able to see on our bill.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions and/or thoughts from the group? Could we do one more, Josh, if you don't mind?
Sure.
France poses another kind of idea. On the other hand, could having subsidizing higher costs benefit solar or renewable energies as these appear even cheaper comparatively?
So here's my thought. I'll just explain maybe better. I'm on my phone, so it's not hard for me to write a question. You remember when HB 411 passed, and the cities have worked really hard and have promised that the rates would not be higher for the people who opt out of solar, right, on renewable energy. Now, if the rates are higher for everybody, then by definition, the rates of renewable energy appear more palatable, if you will, right? And so that's my thinking, and I'm not sure whether I'm articulating it right or whether I'm thinking about it right, but I wonder if that could benefit actually the renewable energy when, eventually the rates will actually appear cheaper. And then therefore, make the transition happen faster, or rethink the transition.
Franz, I think that the extent that we're seeing upward pressure on rates and us, reducing oversight on coal facilities is likely a good argument for an alternative portfolio of resources. How we're going to be able to prove that before the Public Service Commission and SB 224, that this post world of this particular bill, I think we still have to piece through, because it's going to be, it may be that there's a lot of partners and the commission is very willing to sort of navigate the new rules in a creative way, and show that we can do it more cheaply with cleaner resources. But the presumption, as we're seeing it today, is pretty strongly against that. And so we're going to have to do some real homework to look at. Sarah's been, and Logan and our team have been thinking about coal costs and coal futures, something we haven't, coal price costs and coal price futures, which is not something we've looked at very often lately. So it's going to be a whole new world of work.
Okay.
Good question, though.
All right. I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank you, Josh, for all of your amazing leadership on behalf of clean energy at the Capitol this year and throughout the year. And a big thank you to everybody for joining us today, and also for just being a part of the Utah clean energy community. It can't be said enough that we cannot do this work without you. So with that, I think we'll close this first virtual Lunch and Learn, and we'll see you all next time.